In the early hours of May 11, 2012, a quiet cul-de-sac in Derby in the north of England lit up with fire. Thick black smoke billowed out of the windows of 18 Victory Road, the kind of home that you'd not look at twice. Red brick, semi-detached, a garden that needed weeding, nothing unusual there. But that morning, it became the center of a story that would leave the nation horrified. Neighbors were jolted awake by the sound of sirens and the smell of burning plastic. Firefighters smashed their way inside, dragging out limp bodies wrapped in wet sheets and oxygen masks. 6 children, aged between 5 and 13, were pulled from the blaze one by one, all of them unconscious, all of them near death. Standing outside in a white vest and black jogging bottoms, their father, Mick Philpott, sobbed uncontrollably. He wailed, clutched his head, and collapsed in the arms of paramedics. A man destroyed, or so it seemed. The press arrived within hours, snapping pictures of the grieving dad who'd lost his entire family in the most horrendous way imaginable. Donations poured in, messages of support, of sympathy, of pity. But behind the scenes, the fire investigators were already scratching their heads. Something wasn't right. The smell of petrol in the hallway, the absence of any electrical fault, no signs of forced entry. People whispered about faulty wiring, a tragic accident, because that's easier to stomach. The idea that someone could have set that fire on purpose with 6 children asleep upstairs was simply just too grotesque to imagine. And yet, in this case, that is exactly what happened. Before the headlines and the fire, Mick Philpott was already a known oddball in Derby. He wasn't notorious exactly, just recognizably really strange. It's one of those names that made people roll their eyes or lower their voices. Born in 1956, he had all the markings of an ordinary life, right up until he didn't. He joined the army in his teens and served for a few years, mostly without distinction. But it was after his discharge that the unsettling pattern began to form, one of control, coercion, and bursts of violence. In 1978, long before the public ever heard his name, Philpott shot his then-girlfriend in the groin with a crossbow because he thought her dress was too short, then smashed her kneecap in with a hammer because she reportedly was giving too much attention to a child that she was minding. And if you think that's bad, we're just getting started today. He later tried to murder her by stabbing her repeatedly while she slept, after sending him a letter that said she was leaving him. When her mother stepped in to defend her daughter, he turned on her too, stabbing her repeatedly in the leg. Somehow, after all of that, he was sentenced to just 7 years in prison. He served 3. As the years rolled on, Philpott twisted his reputation from dangerous to merely peculiar. He lived with 2 women, his wife, Mai Reed, and a mistress named Lisa, under the same roof, sharing the childcare duties across their growing brood. It wasn't just unconventional, it was practically theatrical. He framed it as generosity, as though he was doing them a favor by playing Lord of the Manor. And this performance didn't stay behind closed doors. He welcomed cameras into his home, smiling and posing with his gaggle of kids, defending his life on daytime television as if it were a sitcom. He seemed to revel in the attention, feeding on the outrage that he generated. Mick Philpott wasn't shy. He was, if anything, quite proud of being detested. If Mick Philpott was a strange figure in Derby, he was practically a pantomime villain in the national press. By the late 2000s, he'd become the poster boy for everything wrong with Britain's welfare system, at least according to certain newspapers. Philpott didn't just claim benefits, he revelled in doing so, which made a sizable section of the British population want to string him up by his ankles. Living in a council house with over a dozen children, 2 adult women, and no steady job, he strutted into morning television studios like he owned them, where he'd sit smugly, arms folded, telling presenters and by extension the nation that he was entitled to the life that he was living. Entitled to the home, the money, the women, the attention. And it worked. He made headlines that can only be described as rage bait in an era when online outrage was still so many years away. Audiences loved to hate him, and the British tabloids, never one to shy away from both celebrating and obliterating in the same sly instance, lapped it up, splashing his grinning face next to increasingly inflammatory headlines about benefit scroungers. And there was something deeply British about how the media treated Philpott. He wasn't ignored or sidelined, he was amplified. Not out of sympathy, but because his life fit a narrative that sold papers and stoked outrage. He wasn't just a man with too many kids and too little shame. He became a caricature of dependency and dysfunction. It was made real. It was made grotesquely human. What got missed in all the shouting was the undercurrent of control behind it all. Philpott wasn't just exploiting the system, he was engineering his world to revolve entirely around him. Every benefit claimed, every media appearance, every smirking interview, none of it was accidental. It was all part of the performance. What exactly happens when the cameras are turned off and the front door closes. Life at 18 Victory Road was far from the tabloid spectacle. No laughs, no cheeky chaos, just a strict, stifling regime where Mick Philpott held court like a petty dictator. Everything and everyone revolved around him. Not in theory, literally. The heating, the food, the sleeping arrangements. Even when you were allowed to go out, it all came down to what Philpott wanted and when. What the public saw was a man juggling wives and children with a wink and a smirk, but what the people inside that house lived with was closer to psychological captivity. Women weren't just partners. It was almost like they were assets, controlled, monitored, and occasionally humiliated. If they challenged him, he'd sulk or shout, or worse. There was always the threat of leaving with the children because Mick always positioned himself as the irreplaceable one. One child later told police that the atmosphere in the house was like walking on eggshells with steel boots. Another said that he wasn't sure who his real mother was. He'd just call both women mum and wait to see who responded. Intimacy, affection, and normal parenting were not on the cards. This was just all about compliance. Neighbors heard shouting, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. You don't call the police for a raised voice in a council estate, especially not when the man behind it waves at you from the driveway each morning like he's running for local office. But inside, things were growing tense. Lisa, the mistress, had started to see through the performance. She wanted out, and Philpott, already seething at the thought of losing her, knew what was at stake. She wasn't just walking away from him. She was threatening to take the children, and with them, the benefits. Lisa Willis moved out in February 2012, taking her 5 children with her. For most people, that would be the end of a troubled domestic chapter, but for Mick Philpott, it was an insult. It was an outrage. She hadn't just left. She'd challenged his control, and worse still, she was taking him to court for custody. To the outside world, Philpott played the role of the wounded father, heartbroken by the loss of his children. But in private, something darker began to brew. Philpott wanted Lisa back, not out of love, but out of spite. And if he couldn't have her, he was going to punish her. And while he was at it, he'd tried to twist the situation in his favor. Maybe she'd come crawling back if she could see how much the children needed him. If not, well, at least he'd keep the spotlight and the benefits. What followed was an idea so grotesque and monstrously self-serving that it is almost impossible to comprehend if you're not already psychotic. Philpott decided he would set his own house on fire. The plan was this: the fire would be small enough for him to save the children, or at least try to, and he'd emerge a hero. Lisa would be blamed. It's not entirely clear how. The public would rally around him, and the court would hand him the kids. It was delusional, theatrical, and fatally flawed. To pull it off, he enlisted Paul Mosley, a friend and drinking buddy whose common sense was perhaps even thinner than his moral compass. If there was ever a Dumb and Dumber, it was these idiots. My Reed, Philpott's obedient wife, went along with it too. Whether out of fear or blind loyalty, she played a part. Petrol was bought, a plan was made, and Philpott, convinced of his brilliance, went to bed on the night of May 10th with everything set. What he hadn't accounted for was just how quickly fire spreads. At around 3:45 a.m. on the 11th of May 2012, Mick Philpott crouched in his hallway and lit the match. He doused the area with petrol, trails leading from the letterbox to the stairs, then stepped back and let the flames do the work. Upstairs, 6 children were sleeping, and within minutes, the house was a furnace. What happened next was chaos. Blazing, choking, blinding chaos. The fire tore through the ground floor at astonishing speed. Thick black smoke shot up the staircase and filled the bedrooms. The kids, Dwayne, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden, they did not stand a chance. Neighbors came running. The fire brigade arrived in under 10 minutes, and Philpott put on the performance of a lifetime, screaming, collapsing, raving about his children still trapped inside. He even had to be physically held back from rushing into the flames, just long enough for plenty of eyewitnesses to see it. 5 of the children were dead within hours. The 6th, Dwayne, died in hospital days later. From the outside, it looked like an unbearable tragedy, a freak fire, a grieving father. There were candlelit vigils, teddy bears tied to lampposts, and endless coverage from reporters who assumed they were covering a devastating accident. Philpott and his wife held their own press conference and gave an Oscar-worthy performance as they choked back tears and thanked neighbors and firefighters for their efforts in trying to save the children. If you didn't know what had really happened, your heart would have ached for them. But with the benefit of hindsight and knowledge to come, the press conference comes across as shambolically evil. But suspicions appeared almost immediately. There were no signs of forced entry, there was no electrical fault, and there was that smell, unmistakable to any trained firefighter: petrol. Investigators found the residue in the hallway. While the pattern of burn marks didn't fit an accidental blaze, it looked deliberate because it was deliberate. Slowly, suspicion started to circle around the father, around the man who'd somehow managed to escape the fire completely unscathed. Public opinion had already shifted by the time the case went to trial in 2013. The grieving father routine had worn thin, replaced by something colder, something closer to disgust. The evidence was damning, and Mick Philpott, for all his confidence, was not a clever man. In fact, he was an idiot. The prosecution laid it out methodically. The petrol trail, the inconsistencies in Philpott's statements, the CCTV footage showing him buying the fuel, the fact that the kids' bedroom doors had been left open, ensuring they'd inhale the toxic smoke. Even his own words betrayed him. In one interview, he referred to the children in the past tense, before they'd even died. Reed and Mosley were in the dock too. Their expressions blank, as though this wasn't their doing, but something unfortunate they'd merely wandered into. Reed claimed she'd been manipulated. Mosley didn't say much at all. And Philpott? He performed again. He cried in court, he banged his fists, shouted about betrayal, and denied everything. But there was no more sympathy to squeeze. The jury saw it for what it was, a vile, arrogant man who'd gambled with his children's lives to claw back control of a woman who no longer wanted him. The charge was manslaughter, not murder, because the intent wasn't to kill, apparently just to stage a scene. But it didn't matter. All three were found guilty. Philpott got life with a minimum of 15 years. Reed and Mosley got 17 years apiece. Light sentences, some argued, for 6 dead children. What happened on Victory Road wasn't just a crime. It was a slow-motion car crash of narcissism, failure, and delusion. And in the middle of it all, 6 children who never stood a chance in life because their father was Mick Philpott. After the verdict, there was a collective exhalation, relief and exhaustion that such a shocking saga was over. The tabloid vultures circled back, this time with genuine outrage instead of furious glee. Politicians used the case to talk about broken Britain, benefit culture, morality and parenting. It made great headlines. Philpott faded from the spotlight not because he was forgotten, but because even scandal has a shelf life. He's serving his sentence, but will be eligible for parole sometime in 2028. But who knows? He might not even make it that far. The now 68-year-old was attacked in prison in March 2025 and left, quote, in a bad way. But alas, this pathetic excuse for a human is now reportedly still going strong. If someone were to end up finishing the job, I think it's probably one of those rare cases where I don't think a single person would really mind, allegedly. Reed was released in 2020 after serving half of her sentence, and Paul Mosley left prison shortly after her. You could argue justice was served, but that depends on your definition, doesn't it? And there were plenty of people who thought these two saw freedom far too early. This is one of those sad stories. A tragedy where 6 lives are lost because of one man's Machiavellian absurdity. Thank you for watching.